Thank you all for joining us for today's Evaluating Journals for Publication workshop. Joining us today is Andrea Worth from the libraries, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her to get us started.
Hi everyone, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I think I see a nod. So yes, thanks for joining me on this Wednesday afternoon. I'm talking today about evaluating new and unfamiliar journals for publication. So this is a workshop that I've been giving for a few years now in different forms, and it changes a little bit every time. So there's some new content in here that I haven't shared before and some content that I've used all along. And if anything at any point along the way doesn't make sense, please feel free to ask questions in whatever format is best for you, either in chat or verbally if folks have the ability to unmute themselves. Just stop me along the way. But with that, I will get started. So I do have an agenda I want to share. So I'm hoping that today you'll go away with these things, a better understanding of some publishing terminology. There's a lot out there, so it won't be everything, but it'll be a start. Some information about metrics and open access as they pertain to evaluating journals, and some additional resources that you can look to as you do move forward with publishing in a journal. So our agenda is actually, we're going to start off with a short activity. It's just really something that needs to be done so that we can come back to it when we're practicing later. So I'll give you a few minutes just to get started on that. I'm going to talk about open access a little bit, and I'll explain more when I get there. But the reason is, even though this workshop is really about any journal, not just open access journals, is this, we get a lot of questions in the library, and I think others students and faculty among themselves ask a lot of questions just about the open access kind of publishing spectrum of journals that's available. And so I do want to make sure we're all on the same page on that particular topic. Of course, we're going to talk about some steps to, or how you might go about evaluating journals for your own publications, and then a little bit of practice, which brings us back to that first activity. And again, you can ask questions along the way. We'll hopefully have time for some questions at the end as well. So I don't know that I'll actually give you a full 5 minutes for this because it may not take that long. If it does, we can certainly use that time. But really what I want you to do is find a couple of journals, whether you're familiar with them or you're just going to go Google for some, that's fine as well, that are in your field, and just to have those at the ready for later. And again, I don't think I'm going to give a full 5 minutes for this. It hasn't been needed in the past. So if you could find some journals in whatever format you want. So, or sorry, not whatever format, in whatever way you want. An internet search is fine. If you have an article in front of you that you're just citing and drawing upon for your own research and you see some journals in the references, pick one of those. If a journal has been recommended to you or you're already thinking about one, it's fine to have that one. And if you wouldn't mind popping one of the titles in the chat. Again, we'll come back to these journals you find a little bit later. So I'm going to quit talking and give maybe 3 minutes. So by my computer, that's 3:07. And we have about 1 more minute. I see a couple of titles in chat. Thank you for that. We haven't got to the journal evaluation part, so it's okay if you're putting a title in there that you're not sure about. Okay, fantastic. I trust everybody has something to work with when we get to the actual activity later, and even as we go through the next few slides, hopefully you can refer to it. All right, so like I said, I'm going to start with a little bit of an open access overview, and this is really just to kind of help folks get on the same page as to what open access is, because it comes up so much in academic publishing. So what it boils down to at its kind of bare minimum is that it's peer-reviewed literature that is both free to read and I put a little asterisk next to the other piece, often free to reuse. So that means that it's available to anybody, anywhere with an internet connection. So online materials can be open access, and you would need an internet connection to get that access. So there's still limitations. You know, the entire population does not have the same, of course, internet access around the world. So there's still limitations, but generally speaking, that gets you to an open access work. You don't need to pay for it. You don't need to log into the site to get to it. You don't need to share any personal information. You can just get to it in whatever method you use to get there. The free to reuse piece, I put the little asterisk there because there's a lot of open works out there and things that will even be called open access, which is perfectly fine. They, of course, just because it's on the internet doesn't necessarily mean that it's free of copyright. So do keep that in mind. Many open access publications, including many journals, have taken that extra step of adding with clarity that there's some additional allowances for use of those works beyond your traditional copyright uses. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but open access generally means that free to access and easy to get to, and then free to reuse, cite, build upon, all of those things where you might have some, with a non-open access work, you might have to seek permission, for example. But these things are clear typically on most good open access documents, what you need to do. So those are the two parts of open access. So what does this mean for publishing open access? So we're talking about journals today. So first and foremost, open access journals. A lot of journals, big publishers and very small, have chosen this model for how they disseminate the work that their authors are submitting. So that can be an enormous publisher like Elsevier, where they have both. They have traditional journals, which are subscription based, and someone's paying for access, whether it's your library or whether it's you without a library, but later on you need to pay for a single article, for example. But then Elsevier also has a whole suite, probably hundreds at this point, of open access journals where no reader's ever going to have to pay directly for those journals. They just can get to them. There's online archives and repositories. So I do want to just mention that because as you get into the publishing process, you'll start to, and maybe some of you have experienced this already, where you'll get a lengthy, either potentially a PDF document, but probably more likely a click-through online these days, where you're agreeing to certain terms of publishing with a particular journal, and they may reference something like, even though you can't share the final publisher PDF, you can take a version of your record. We're allowing you as an author publishing with us to take a version of your article and share it in something like a repository. These repositories can be disciplinary. If there's anybody out there in physics, there's one called Archive. If you're in the medicine or biological sciences, there's a newer one, BioArchive. This is BIOARXIV. And then there's local ones at institutions. So digital scholarship at UNLV is, if you've heard that term, that is another local UNLV focused repository. The other way people sometimes encounter open access for the first time is kind of a hybrid of all these things. When your funder or perhaps your employer, depending on where you work, requires that you actually make your work open access. The idea being that more access to this research is for the greater good, more people can build upon it. And those are some requirements of the US federal government, as well as private foundations such as the Gates Foundation, and then institutions, often universities, although not at this one, require that authors make their work open access. So hopefully this appeals to most of you, but I understand open access is not for everybody. There is something called the Directory of Open Access Journals. If you are intrigued by this idea and do want to find a journal that is known to be open access without kind of doing the Google search that you did a few moments ago, you can go to the Directory of Open Access Journals. They index journals that meet the criteria that they specify. There's a bit of a hurdle for journals to get listed here, like they really do their best due diligence they can to only get quality journals in there. So there's certain requirements that need to be met. And at this point, when I took the screenshot a few months ago, it was 15,000 journals or so. All right, so I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions about open access before I kind of move back into the realm of all journals. Looking at the chat, not hearing anything. Okay, I will keep going. All right, so the next part of this is really the meat of the workshop, the evaluating a journal that you may not be familiar with. So two considerations I like to think about: is a journal a good match for your publishing goals? And just, are there any concerns or red flags about the journal? Like, it sounds like a great topic, but what do you see it on there? How they present themselves to the world, or what you've read. Maybe you've come across articles in it, and does it seem like good scholarship? So first off, we'll talk about what I think might be some goals. If folks want to share some other things that I've missed here, that would be wonderful. So probably not unfamiliar to most of you is citations are really big currency in academic publishing. It is important to have work that's out there and meaningful. And while citations in no way directly relate to the quality of work, because things can get cited for bad reasons, they can have low citations and yet still have an immense impact on a group of people or society or something. Things can take a while in different disciplines to ramp up. Certain disciplines in the sciences, for example, citations are very quick, and in journals in humanities and maybe some of the social sciences take a little longer and have a longer tail to build up. But regardless, people value citations, and understandably so. We also, of course, a lot of activity happens on social media about new science and new research. And so people are starting to value those as well, and have been for probably several years now, for sure. But you also want to communicate your work in a respectable venue. You want that journal to be something good, and you want to have your work alongside other works that you're proud to have your article lined up next to. I include this one because I think we all think the peer review is probably a very scary part, and we also dread that in some cases it can take a while for peer review to happen. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the vetting by peers is really important. And it doesn't have to be kind of the traditional double-blind peer review. I guess I will get to that a little bit later, but something that helps kind of critique the work. So this could be an open forum on the internet. Many legitimate journals are kind of moving to that model. Sometimes the peer review gets published along with the article. And then there's also the very traditional double blind. You want your good work to be found. So I think probably a lot of folks outside of librarianship maybe don't think about this too much, but all of those great databases you might be going to find your works that you want to cite for what you're starting to do your research on, or maybe already well into your research. Someday it'd be nice if your article was in those as well. So whether it's an engineering database or a humanities database, literature database, whatever it is, you want your work to be there most likely. So looking for those. And then another thing that probably not a lot of folks think about, but if you're at the beginning of your career, or even if you're not, or if you're even having a career transition, hopefully in a decade from now, 50 years from now, a century from now, just like we can read works that were published, centuries ago, hopefully your work is still there, even though it appeared perhaps only ever in a digital format. You want it to be around for a while. This relates to being able to publish your work and also have your thesis and dissertation piece. So it's a little bit of if I could have illustrated a bit of a tangent, this would be related to that. But a lot of folks worry about putting their thesis or dissertation out online, which as part of UNLV and many other academic institutions, you're given that option as graduate students if you're working on a thesis or a dissertation. And oftentimes, understandably, you're wanting to publish articles, or perhaps required even to publish articles based on that research. There are some publishers who frown upon the practice of having the thesis or dissertation made available prior to or around the time of article publications based on the same research. But there are many publishers who do not see that as a problem, and they have different reasons. For some of them, it's because they know the work in the thesis or the dissertation is going to be changed so much because it's just a different process when you're writing the thesis or dissertation versus when you're writing a journal article, and so the content is not going to be an exact match. I would just encourage you in this particular tangent, if you're getting to this point, as you're thinking maybe about sharing your work more broadly, whether that's open access, journal publishing, or whether that's sharing your thesis or dissertation either yourself or through something like UNLV's repository, or if you move on to another institution for another advanced degree, their repository, just take the time to figure out what your journal is telling you, because I think these things interrelate, and that the article is not necessarily the only thing that comes out of your research here at UNLV or elsewhere. Your thesis or dissertation is another valuable document that people can get access to in that same way if it's not hidden, but it comes down to your publisher. So back to kind of this journal evaluation. So alongside kind of having your goals and what you want to be allowed to do with your work, as we just talked about with the thesis, I like to relate this to evaluating a website, which is probably extremely familiar to all of us, especially in the last few years where there's been so much talk about misinformation and just being able to decipher and sift through good information, or at least information that's intended to be good. So I'm going to talk just briefly about website evaluation, so bear with me. So some positive things that one might see on a website are some kind of superficial things. This isn't the be all to end all for sure, but that's being kept up, that's current, technology works. If you're scrolling through or doing a search on a website or something, you want that to work if you're going to use it for whatever your information need is at that point in time. I guess related to that, navigation. It should be easy to navigate, or at least logical to navigate. If not easy, it can be very complex, of course, but some way that makes sense. If you know what you're looking for, how do you get there on that particular website? And then something that's trustworthy. So an ability to determine, I'm not sure I know about this website. I've never heard of it before. It looks good. Who's creating it? Where's the money coming from? Who supports it? Is there a board? That kind of thing, where you might kind of, check to see if the information is being developed by somebody you trust or groups that you trust. And then on the not so great side of things, and again, this is for websites, you might have surprises like pop-up ads, hidden fees. You think you're about to get to that, table or statistic or piece of information that's what you're after, and then you can only read half the page before you pay a fee. So while that might be a legitimate business model for them, absolutely, it should be clear that that's what you're getting into as you go there. You don't want it to be outdated, so the information should be kept up to date if they're presenting themselves as an authority on a topic. And then just some poor editing issues, content doesn't maybe screams to get your attention, but then once you dig in, it's really not telling you anything new. It's repurposing maybe information that's available in another setting. And then this, I don't know if this happens too much, but you do a search for a site that you know exists, and then you end up on the site that's the .info or the .com instead of the .edu or something. So just, there are some deceptive things too, not just accidents, but purposeful, trying to look like somebody else. So I would say a lot of these things can happen in the journal publishing world too. Sometimes it's accidental. It's not, I think most journal publishers and editors, of course, are doing their best with very different budgets. So again, going back to the one-off journal that might be published by a small institution somewhere can be absolutely as legitimate as any journal published by a large multinational corporation that publishes thousands of journals. But that doesn't mean that each of those individual journals within those suites shouldn't kind of be evaluated on its own merits. And again, going back to your purpose, so does it fit your article and your research and the things we just talked about? you know, whether it's actually looks like it's doing what it says it's doing as a journal. So this is probably very small on many of your screens. I have a link that is probably that I can give to you, and you're going to briefly see my sloppy notes for a second while I grab this for the chat. So, and I'll share these links again at the end, but oops. But this author's checklist we developed a while ago, and again, it was a little bit in the context of trying to get past some deceptive practices by open access journals, but really a lot of it was written with the intention that these apply to all journals. So there's probably a few things on here that might not resonate with you, and then there may be some things you're really thinking about that aren't on here. So don't take this as like a one-to-one, if it meets all these boxes, you're good to go. It's really kind of a resource for ideas, but we're going to spend some of the next few slides going through some of these, not everything that's on this list. And some of them I alluded to a little bit earlier, but this is available for you. It's things to think about. Everything from those first impressions we just talked about in the land of websites to how to kind of take the open access piece of it into account down at the bottom and everything in between. Actually, I think before I go through some of these, I'm going to pause again to see if there's any questions. Or I probably should have asked if anybody can think of any other thing they would look for on a website that might translate to journal evaluation. Okay, not seeing anything, going to move on. So one of the first things on that author's checklist for evaluating journals was the first impressions. And I know there's a lot on this slide, and honestly, there's going to be a lot of text on the next few slides. This is really meant to be an example. We're not going to read through this, but the first impression I got of this journal called Research Inventi, and it's been a little while since I got this email, so I actually haven't checked in on it to see if it's still there, was that they put a lot of information on an email. So this was not grabbed from a web page. This was an invitation that a lot of folks get, often perhaps rightly so, ends up in one spam folder. This one did not, so it caught my eye. They had a lot of things on here that wanted to talk to me about how great the journal was. And I will just say that there were a few things that struck me right off the bat about this. And I don't know that this happens often, but this hasn't been the only time it's happened to me, where wherever they got my email address from, they lumped it in with a bunch of other people and didn't use like a BCC option. So when I went to this on the top of the screen, you can kind of see some other folks' names there. I could actually see a list of thousands of people that they sent the same email to. And well, that could have been an accident. It could have been just an error from the office. It did seem, it kind of gave me pause because I could have replied to all 1,000 of those people if I wanted to, and I did not. Some other things they wanted to highlight were these impact factors, which were literally highlighted in the email. And so we'll talk about metrics in a little bit, but don't be persuaded immediately if you get kind of this very kind request to share your research in a particular venue and they want to tell you about metrics. You're going to have an opportunity, or I guess you do have an opportunity, and you should take the opportunity to go and find out what those metrics mean and if they're the metrics that you should value and if it's the ones that your discipline values and other types of things. So there are a few things about this particular call. All right, the next one, probably even smaller on your screen. This was a journal that was a little bit closer to my realm of library and information science, not an exact match. That previous one, I think, was very multidisciplinary. This is actually a website that I somehow ended up on, and there were just some confusing things here. So they're, I think, saying at the top where they're indexed, because I recognize something like Google Scholar. We probably all use Google Scholar, which is completely fine, and we hope our journal and articles are found there. But there are some other things up there that I'm not going to go into, but they're really not indexes where one would go to find research. In the fine print below the icons, there's some additional things listed there. And while this screenshot is a couple of years old, it's definitely not from 2014. And if you look closely down in the lower left, there's a copyright there from 2014. And all of those things do not say immediately that the articles in this journal are bad. I honestly didn't go read it, and it was outside of my discipline, so even if I did, I wouldn't necessarily been able to make sense of these things. But they're all little flags that kind of go back to that, is this content good, and would I want to be, do I want my name associated with this site? I might very well want to, but I just need to take the time to do that due diligence, and some things definitely give me pause. Moving on. So I talked a little bit about peer review, and this is another part of the checklist. So policies. Peer review is often a part of kind of the journal's policies, how they operate, what their standards are in this particular case for how they manage peer review. Typically, and again, peer review along with publishing in so many other ways is changing. This doesn't necessarily have to be this way, but typically there's a vetting by editor first. Did you submit to the correct journal? Does what you think, your article, how it fits in a particular journal, does the editor agree that this should even go out, take the next step and go to the next review? And that's valuable because people sometimes do, maybe misinterpret what the journal, types of articles or the subject of the article that will be accepted. There's a process for recruiting reviewers. It should be somebody that can speak intelligently, hopefully kindly, critically in a good way that will help you improve your article. And that takes a little bit to get someone who's likely a volunteer, I should say 3 someones who are likely volunteers to do that. So the journal will take a little bit of time to get those reviewers going, most likely, not always. Once all the review happens, you're probably going to get, you might get the direct feedback mediated through the editor, but from those reviewers, whether it's anonymous or not. But you're probably also going to get some kind of summary from the editor that tells you kind of, this is the gist, this is what you need to do to improve it, or maybe you get the really good news that minor changes are only required. Other than that, it looks good. But that's all going to take a little bit of time. I mentioned earlier that there can be all sorts of types of review. It used to be that double blind was the gold standard. In many cases, it still is, but there are going to be some journals out there who don't anonymize things in the interest of people will be perhaps even more forthcoming if they know everybody can see everybody's comments on that. I don't think that plays out the same in all the disciplines, but certainly in some. And again, I know there's some medical journals that are going to the length to publish, if not all, parts of the peer reviews that come back on the articles they publish. And just really to underscore, peer review takes time. So why am I talking so much about peer review and policies? If you go to a journal that says, we have a quick turnaround for this, you can submit your article tomorrow and we're going to have an answer for you by Sunday. It's possible that whatever their publishing model is, that makes sense and you might agree to it. But again, it's kind of like that dated copyright notice on the previous slide. It might be a red flag if you really want to get that valuable feedback before your work goes out to the world. So another thing is content. I alluded to this earlier, but just, are you citing the articles published? Like, one of the best places for you to probably find a journal to publish in is your own reference list. So if you're finding, kind of recurring journal titles showing up in your reference list, that might be a great spot. If you've kind of done for the sake of this exercise that we'll get to, just Googled around for a journal and landed on one that sound good, but it's not anywhere in your reference list, maybe just kind of check, because it could mean a couple of things. One is it wasn't indexed where you did your research, and maybe there's some really valuable stuff in there that does need to be incorporated into your research. But the other piece is it just turns out it's not a good match for the content of your article. Doesn't mean it's a bad journal, doesn't mean your article is bad. It just means it might not be a good match. So, so that's kind of the content piece. Is the journal you're considering formatted professionally? Has it been copy edited? Have other articles been copy edited? There's a lot of digital links in references now. Like, if you look at journals from a few decades ago, it was just a citation. You had to go find it. Everything, of course, being online and some standards behind how citations appear at the end of journals, you're very often given something that looks, it's a digital object identifier. It usually has the letters DOI in it, and you can go right to it. So those are important pieces that may not seem apparent, but that's actually working to make kind of interconnections between research more apparent. So those are important things to consider. And I have this comment here that do the articles that you're seeing in the journal represent good science? It doesn't have to be science. Is it good writing? Is it, again, that goes back to whether it kind of matches what you're hoping to convey with your own work. Down at the bottom, I have I'll allude to something called Retraction Watch a few times. It covers all types of journals for articles that get retracted for all types of reasons, sometimes very legitimate reasons, sometimes for things that never should have been published. This being one of them, where there's been a few sting operations on journals where people will submit junk science to see which journals publish them. And the article, Bats Are Really Cool Animals, did get published in several journals. Okay, I mentioned indexing earlier. This is another example where if you're not seeing the indexes that are familiar to you, and so again, by this I mean things like Scopus, Web of Science, probably going to get some of these names wrong, but there's some anthropology indexes out there. Anything that you see on the library's databases list, which definitely familiarize yourself with if you're not familiar already. Those are the kind of the indexes I'm talking about. Things EBSCOhost is probably a brand of databases that you might be familiar with. You want to look for those types of things. And so what I've highlighted here with the red arrow is, so I mentioned EBSCO, which again is more of a company and a suite of databases than an individual database. So most things don't get indexed across all EBSCO services. They've also misspelled it. So look for things like that. And then the purple arrows, maybe, but really these are pointing out to different, I think for the most part, libraries. And libraries, generally speaking, aren't indexers of academic content. We manage our own scholars' research sometimes and help make it available, like I talked about with those repositories, but we are not taking the world of literature and doing indexing. So it's a little unclear what this particular journal means by that. And so I would, again, go back to trusting your instincts. If you see something like California State University, Monterey listed as an index, what does that mean? Maybe they are indexing a lot of things or this particular journal, but that would be good to ask about. Author rights, I alluded to this a little bit earlier when different journals have different policies for how much an author submitting to their journal, how many rights they get to keep in return, and how many rights the authors get to keep in return. So traditionally, you go through a copyright transfer process, and this is very common. It's not to be alarmed, you just need to be comfortable with it. So your work is your work, and it's your copyright and your co-authors, if you have co-authors, until a point at which you give those rights away. And some journals very legitimately, again, do this they just do this in the model that we have. They'll ask you to transfer the copyright to them, so they're in charge of any, say, for example, violations of copyright. If someone tries to pass your work off as theirs, it's the journal's responsibility to chase that down and take care of it, not yours. They may ask for exclusive rights, so even if they don't ask for a transfer of copyright, they might ask you to agree that they're going to be the only ones that publish it. So how much that means you can use it otherwise, you'd want to learn more about that. And then at the kind of a lighter end of the traditional approach is non-exclusive rights. So maybe they want to be the first publisher of it, but wait 12 months and you can share it all over the internet and they wouldn't care. They just want to have that first right. Becoming a lot more common, especially with anytime you publish in a journal that allows open access. Either the journal is completely open access or the journal gives you the option to make something open access, you're going to get asked to apply a Creative Commons license, and this goes to that reuse of work that I talked a little bit about earlier. So you don't have time to delve into Creative Commons. Generally speaking, the journal may impose what license they want you to use if you're choosing that model. They may give you some choices, so there's a spectrum. Some people are very free with their scholarship and say, all you need to do is give me credit for the original work, but have at it. You can repurpose, remix, copy, paste, share in your classrooms, put it in an anthology, do anything as long as you give me credit. And then there's some more restrictive things where I'm going to let you use it as long as you're a nonprofit organization. But if you're trying to sell this commercially, you can't do it. So know that those things exist and review your author agreement before signing, just so you know you're not surprised later that you may no longer own copyright, or you're not surprised that you've applied a Creative Commons license to your work. So this is kind of when we get into that checklist where we're really down in the part about the open access piece specifically. And this is what gives people so much pause about this. If you count them up, most open access journals do not charge a publication fee. However, many of the ones that are really well known have the impact factors alongside other traditional journals or are published by big companies such as Biomed Central, Springer, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis Sage, all of those ones. They often have article processing charges. And this is a little bit dated of information. I haven't found another study that was comprehensive, but the average is a $904, and this was 9 years ago. So it's gone up, I'm sure, a little bit since then. And I can tell you that the biggest article processing charge for an open access publication is more than $5,000 now. I don't remember what it is. I believe it's one of the Nature journal. Actually, I think it is the journal Nature, and I think it's upwards of around $10,000 to make an article open access. So yeah, it is what it is. So I mentioned Retraction Watch earlier. I realize most people are probably not as interested in this particular piece of it as me, but I just wanted to say that if you are hearing that all open access journals are predatory, or people have other legitimate concerns about open access, I just want to reiterate that the same concerns for some open access publishing can apply to traditionally published journals as well. Retraction Watch finds all types of things that have happened with journals across the spectrum, no matter what their models and costs are. And this particular one is a little bit dated, but it was, I think, where somehow the authors had the ability to review their own works in this particular journal, and there were like 7 papers all at once that got pulled. So it can happen at any time, and there's not really, you won't do that. It's possible in the journal that you choose to publish in can have an issue, but just do your good work and you should be fine. I think I'll skip this one. It's another Retraction Watch one. I do have a couple of slides that again just bring home the importance of kind of having all this peer review, putting your work in an excellent place to publish, no matter the publishing model. I don't remember the specifics of this case, but the bad science can be really costly for publishers and others. So CrossFit in this case had an issue with research that was done about, I believe, the safety of their machines, or maybe the safety of their program. I'm not a CrossFit person. Another one is, this was open access related. There was a publisher called Omics. I don't think they really exist a lot anymore. So it's problematic for, this particular issue was problematic for a lot of reasons, but basically their deceptive practices got so bad that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, got involved several years ago and basically found that they were not doing that peer review piece, charging authors to publish, saying they were doing excellent peer review, and this had to do with their conferences as well. There was also a group that hosted conferences, and then not doing the peer review, treating authors terribly, like when authors realized there was something wrong, trying to get their articles back and being told, sorry, you've already given us control of this article, we won't give it back, you need to pay us. So anyway, it's can be quite a bit. And then 2019, they were, and I don't know if they actually have paid or not, but over $50 million in fines from the FTC for that. So this is not in any way to scare you about the journals, but just kind of a reality check that it is important to find those good journals and use the resources that you have to find those ones. I do want to talk a little bit about metrics. That's a little bit of a, I think, backing up the article, excuse me, the author's checklist. I'll go through this pretty quickly. I have a colleague, Christina Miskey, who some of you probably attended a workshop earlier this week. She is our resident expert on metrics. So if you want to know more, she is the person to reach out to. But impact factor is one that you'll see a lot. I mentioned earlier that, of course, all of the things we do on social media have an impact as well, in addition to research getting cited in, maybe a major newspaper. Or even talked about on the local news or something, definitely has an impact because it brings it to other people's attention, even if it's not the scholars in your field. So I think there's definitely a kind of an understanding where maybe, a few decades ago, really the idea was that you needed to talk to the people that were doing research similar to yours in most cases. Now there's much more of an understanding that the public has often an interest in the research that we're all doing. And some members of the public will want the right to have the access to the research if they feel they participated in the funding of it. So that could be back to those federal agencies. Anyway, this all boils down to, like how available it is. So if you're sharing an article on Twitter or something, can someone who's working for a nonprofit that's interested in your work get access to that article? If they can, maybe they share it out themselves. And I think I glossed over impact factor. That has kind of been the standard for a long time. And I think I have another slide on this, but there is a way through the library's databases to very quickly get the impact factor for the journal you're considering, if that is something that is prioritized by, if you prioritize that, you'll be able to get the legitimate impact factor from the library's databases. Yes, so it's something called journal citation reports. Again, I'm sort of picking on Omics here because I know they had that very legitimate issue, or sorry, the FTC had the very legitimate issue with them. I wouldn't trust the journal if they share their impact factor in some circumstances. I would want to go out to the journal citation reports and look for it if that is important to you. Not having an impact factor does not mean that a journal is low quality. It could be new. It could be that they've chosen to stay out of impact factors and they don't want the company that produces these to use their thing because they don't believe in them. There's a pretty significant movement in some realms of academia where the impact factor is people don't see it as legitimate anymore. So if it's not in the database, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means you don't have that particular piece of information. All right, so a long time ago, I asked you to go and search for a couple of journals that you could potentially refer back to. So this is your chance. So take a look at your journal. I'll give you about 5 minutes for this. So go to the About page, if there is one. Is there anything, and I put in here red flags, but it doesn't really have to be a red flag like something is wrong with the journal. It could be more about the kind of the second bullet where, the journal might look perfectly legitimate, but does it turn out that it's, does it seem like it's taking the type of work you're doing, both in content and in type of research? So check those things out. So that About page is a suggestion. You can certainly go to other sections of the journal. And then I'm hoping, and I'll drop this link in chat, that you may also be able to get to the journal citation reports. This is a subscription database, so if you are not on campus or on campus but not on a kind of a computer that's connected to the network, you will need your ACE account to log in. I have a couple other sites that offer different metrics. They aren't going to give you the impact factor as calculated by journal citation reports, but you could use those instead. And the two others on there are free to get to. You don't need ACE or anything to get to them. So I've dropped the link in chat. Hopefully that works. Let me know if it doesn't. So again, to clarify, for the next 5 minutes, your task is to take one or both, if you have time, of those journals you found earlier, do some digging in it. What are you finding? And maybe be prepared to report out anything that you've found about it that makes it look good or not. And I'm going to scroll back up the chat and grab a couple of those titles that people shared earlier and do my own looking as well. So I will see you back here at 3:52. And really, I'm here if anybody has questions. Got about 2 minutes left, and we'll circle back for what folks found. All right, hopefully everybody had a chance to, and I do see a question in there. Awesome, I just now saw that. Hopefully everybody had a chance to do a little investigating of their journal. So I'd be curious to hear what folks found. Uh, Andrea, you commented that both of your journals didn't yield results. Is that common? Is that for the journal citation reports part of it?
Yeah, so I put them in the website that you recommended, and there was nothing that would show up. And their websites don't list their impact factors for those journals.
Okay. Yeah, remind me, I should have brought up the journal impact factors myself, or the journal citation reports myself, and I did not. Let me see if I can get there real quick. And you can probably all see my activity with the journal citation reports. So get started. Can you remind me what your journal was? One of your journals was?
School social work?
Oh, I think I did this. Is this published out of an institution, right?
Yes, the Illinois something, I
Okay.
believe.
Yeah, so I just wanted to double check. Yeah, you can see in my search that also didn't produce that. I'm kind of not surprised, and this goes back to my point about not being in this database shouldn't in itself be a concern. Now, if you had found that journal was sharing, like saying, hey, we have an impact factor of 12.2, whatever it might be, or 0.05, it can have a huge range. And then you got here and found that it wasn't in here, that would be a huge red flag. But if they're not saying they have an impact factor and you're also not finding it here, I would just, you'd need to move on to something else uh, that's going to help you assess this journal. It might mean that unfortunately, a lot of smaller publishers have a difficult time getting into some of these resources that I've pointed to. So some of those big indexes, it takes some work on their part to share their metadata, to share everything that is needed to kind of calculate those impact factors. And so a lot of times it's a capacity, and I don't know if this is a small journal, I just noticed it wasn't published by one of the big publishers that I was familiar with. So that could very well be the reason they're not in there, and or they may have chosen not to participate in the impact factor score. How did everybody else do? Did anybody see anything on their journals that they want to share or can share? I looked up some of your journals, so while folks are thinking, I looked up some of the journals you shared earlier, so thank you for doing that. I noticed several people landed on Taylor and Francis journals, which is fine. Taylor and Francis is a well-established, robust publisher. I noticed that I think all of them are, sorry, I shouldn't say all of them, the three I looked up are all subscription-based journals, but at the top of the page, this sometimes can be confusing for me and confusing for other folks. It'll say publish open access in this journal. I don't know if anybody else noticed that. That is essentially a journal that's having options for both worlds. So, your library or other, if you're in the future an employer, somebody might be paying access to Taylor and Francis for that journal or for their whole suite of journals. But then authors who are publishing with the journal, knowing that, may be concerned and they want to publish in this great journal they found, but they want to also make it available more globally. And so they'll pay the publishing fee. I bet I didn't go look at those journals specifically, but I bet the publishing fees for at least one or two of the 3 or 4 that I looked up are probably in the realm of $2,000 or $3,000. So it's definitely not an insubstantial amount. So I just want to throw that out there. Don't be alarmed if you see the open access option. If you happen to have grant support or a co-author that has support for publishing open access, it might be a really good option for you to kind of take that extra step to get your work beyond the subscribers that are out there in the world. Did anybody find their journal and journal citation reports? Oh, thanks for letting us know, Melanie. Did it match? If the journal said what their citation or what their impact factor was, did it match? I should caveat that by saying the journal citation reports comes out annually. It's entirely possible that a journal hasn't updated for the latest edition, so hopefully it's in the realm. Yeah, that makes sense. Something really strange would have to happen with the journal publishing model for them to have a huge jump or decline from any year to year. They usually take a couple of years to figure citation factor, or excuse me, impact factor. Okay, so we're pretty much at time. I hope I opened the floor up enough for discussion. There weren't too many questions, but if anybody does have a last question, I'm happy to take it. I'm also available to you if you need me separate from this workshop. The checklist, I shared the URL a couple of times, but now I'm going to put that in there. There's one other document in this folder that has another resource it covers journal citation reports, some other things that we didn't even come close to talking about. Use it as you can, but otherwise it's got some handy links on there. And it's basically the things on this page, so I will just leave that there. And then again, you're welcome to reach out to myself, Christina, who some of you may have met on Monday, I think, or of course, liaison librarians. If you haven't come across your liaison librarian yet, I highly recommend you check out the library's website and find your disciplinary expert in the libraries to ask questions of. And if there aren't any questions, I think we're done.